Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Conor Byrne. I work with Fortinet. I see it's just gone 2 o'clock. We probably still have some people to join the call. So while we're waiting for them to join, I might give you a brief introduction to Fortinet. And after that, we'll get stuck into the main topic, which is protecting your network from zero-day threats with Fortisandbox. So who are we and what do we do? Fortinet were founded in the year 2000 by brothers Ken and Michael Z after they sold their previous venture, which was NetScreen. And we're a global organization with many offices around the world and nearly 5,000 employees at this stage. We have a market capitalization of 10.5 billion, and the billings in 2018 will be in the region of 2 billion. And our install base of customers is by far and away the largest of all vendors, with over 34,000 network security customers. In fact, we ship almost 30% more, or 30% of the total network security appliances globally, more than any other vendor. And we're very much a technology focused company. Our company is built on innovation, and you can see that reflected really in the number of patents issued to Fortinet every year. This graph shows the number of security devices shipped by Fortinet and how it's consistently far more than our nearest competitors. And in Ireland, Fortinet became the #1 security vendor in 2012. And we've managed to maintain that position since then. The graph doesn't show 2017, but we were #1 in 2017. And these figures, by the way, are from IDC. And it's often a good idea to look at independent third-party certification before making an investment or a major decision in relation to your network security. And NSS labs are often a good place to start because they're entirely impartial, not pay to play. And to receive a recommendation from NSS labs, you need to not only be best in class for price performance, but also best in class for security effectiveness, which is obviously quite a difficult thing to do. And in 2017, we received 11 recommendations from NSS labs for our products, and those ranged from obviously next generation firewall, but also WAF, IPS, and breach detection systems, which is what they call ATP solutions or sandboxing solutions, which is what we'll be looking at today. I'm sure you have heard the guys at Novosco, maybe Keith or Lee, mentioned the Fortinet Security Fabric previously. The Security Fabric really means that rather than our platforms operating separately as disparate point solutions, we take the approach that your network should operate as a cooperative system. And a key part of that system is the Fortisandbox, which is our advanced threat protection platform. And we'll see later on the way that many elements of the Fortinet fabric, including FortiMail, FortiClient, FortiGate, and FortiADC, can submit files or samples to Fortisandbox for advanced threat analysis. And then if the sandbox detects an unknown threat, that intelligence is shared not just with the original element that submitted the file, but with every element of the fabric. But today we're going to be talking about zero-day threats. And for the purists amongst us, the real definition of a zero-day threat is a threat that exploits an unknown vulnerability. So something which the developers of the product or the software, they're not aware of this threat, and obviously for that reason a patch hasn't yet been released. But the term zero-day threat, it's often used to describe any threats which haven't been seen before. So really what we're talking about here today are these unknown threats which often go undetected by traditional signature-based AV technologies. So when is signature-based AV no longer enough? Well, I suppose the answer to this these days is really that almost always signatures aren't enough, because when you think about the number of malware signatures that would be required, the database would get huge and would be too slow to check every sample against every known signature. And this graph is taken directly from Verizon's data breach report in 2016. And they found that, excuse me, 99% of malware hashes, excuse me, are seen only for 58 seconds or less. So no defenses that are purely signature based will be able to keep up with that rate of change. And in the same report, they say that a unique hash does not mean you have been targeted by an ultra sophisticated group of nation state malware ninjas. So brand new, previously unseen malware is very common, it's ubiquitous, and it's very short-lived. But why is there so much malware constantly being produced? Well, part of the reason is that the characters involved have changed. And I'm not going to labor this point. You've all heard this story before, I'm sure, that you know, gone are the days when hackers with you know, spotty teenagers in their bedroom are the ones that are doing the cyber criminality. These days, it's much more likely that cyber threats are produced by well-run, organized criminal organizations. And of course, their usual motivation is money. And they can monetize these threats in lots of different ways by trading personal information, such as healthcare information, by obviously stealing credit card information, by holding victims to ransom, either with DDoS attacks or ransomware. And of course, something that's becoming more popular these days is cryptocurrency mining. And because of this drive to make money, if your data is valuable enough to the attacker, they will spend the time discovering what type of security you are using, and they'll develop a unique malware to ensure that they will evade detection by your defenses. So this is what we mean when we talk about advanced persistent threats and advanced threat protection. So these days, it's really not hard at all to get around those signature-based basic AV platforms. And one way that threat actors do this is using crypters or do-it-yourself crypting tools like the ones shown here. And a crypter is a type of software that can encrypt or obfuscate malware to make it harder to detect by security programs. And they're used typically to create malware that presents itself as a harmless program until it gets installed. And these programs allow you to quickly generate new unique malware variants with very little expense. And you know, you can see yourself there, it's GUI based, it's point and click. There's not very much skill required. And then of course, once you have your piece of malware, you can upload it to something like VirusTotal or a similar website, and you can check which vendor AV solutions it will evade. Of course, if you don't want to create your own malware, you could always use one of the many crypting managed services available. And this allows cyber criminals to obtain malicious executables, the ones really that have the best chance of being effective without having to build anything on their own, and typically at a very reasonable price. And I'm sure some of you will remember the T-1000 from Terminator 2, who was able to morph into other people and things to evade detection. And polymorphic malware does pretty much the same thing. It's a type of malware that constantly changes its appearance, ensuring that no two samples ever look the same. And this type of malware has actually been around quite a while, but leading sort of AV vendors will do a good job at detecting client-side polymorphic malware, but the server-side polymorphism can be more difficult to detect because the engine driving the mutation it's essentially on the server side and therefore can't be examined. And we can see that these unknown samples are the ones that are doing the damage by looking again at Verizon's data breach report. They found that only 20,000 of nearly 30 million, that's about less than 1% of the pieces of malware were common to more than one organization. So in other words, almost all malware which was involved in a data breach was unique to the organization which was impacted. So we can detect malware that is known or even very suspicious. And I'm sure if you're using Fortinet or FortiGates or FortiMails or FortiClient today, the Fortinet CPRL-based AV engine would be doing exactly that, with updates coming from FortiGuard, of course. And if we examine, digitally signed files or whitelists, we can, of course, detect files that are definitely good and not containing any threats. But it's the files in the middle that are more challenging, and they require a little bit more analysis, and that's exactly where the Fortisandbox comes in. So let's take a look at the Fortisandbox and how it can detect and mitigate unknown and zero-day threats. So Fortisandbox follows a multi-stage workflow until the security posture of a sample is known. And the way it does this is basically the fastest and least CPU intensive functions happen earlier in the workflow. And the goal is always to detect the threats with minimal resource usage. And this ultimately keeps the cost of the solution down and the performance up. So let's look at these 5 stages individually. The first stage is code emulation, and code emulation can take a program instruction by instruction and imitate what the program would do if it were to be run. It then does a heuristic analysis of these instructions and makes a determination as to whether the file contains something malicious and would do something malicious were it to be run. And the beauty of code emulation is that the code is never actually ran in the sandbox, so evasion is not possible. The next step is Fortinet's AV engine, which focuses on behavioral rather than pattern matching technology. It decodes and tracks behaviors of polymorphic, encrypted, and packers around malware. And as the engine operates very, very quickly, it makes sense to do this in one of the earlier stages of the workflow within the sandbox. Next is complex pattern recognition language. This is the Fortinet patented AV technology, which is actually in, as I mentioned earlier, the FortiGates and FortiClient and FortiMail and really any Fortinet product with an AV engine. And CPRL helps to write programs that focus on functionality and behavior rather than just on patterns of bytes. And it addresses some of the performance and effectiveness issues with signature-based AV. The main advantage, though, is that a single signature can match one virus and all of its variants. That's the beauty of the CPRL language. And this obviously improves performance. But the big difference between, say, FortiGate or FortiMail is that the CPRL signature database is far bigger because a sandbox by its nature doesn't have to be a very low latency device. We can have a more complete AV database on the sandbox. Step 4, and this is an important last chance for the sandbox to process the file very quickly. before full VM extraction is required. And this is where a hash of the file is sent to FortiCloud, and it's compared against a huge database, a multi-terabyte database of known samples. And this database is also fed by other Fortinet products and other sandboxes deployed around the globe. And what is returned to the Sandbox client is a verdict and a report. And if the verdict has been supplied by an up-to-date engine and database, then Fortisandbox uses the report. Otherwise, it continues the analysis by submitting the sample to the next stage. And stage 5, this is where the really clever stuff happens. This is where the file is executed in a VM, either Windows or Mac or Android, as you can see on the screen. And Fortisandbox does a number of anti-evasion techniques, including it changes the time forward and back in case there's some sort of sleeping function built into the malware. It simulates human interaction by doing mouse movement. It does hardware emulation and other human behavior. I will see this later if we have a chance to have a look at the Sandbox. We can see a recording of the VMs, and you can actually see the mouse movements as it executes a file within the VM. And all changes and processes and connections out to the internet are monitored by the Sandbox's tracer engine. And then based on all of that information, it makes a determination as to whether the file or the URL indeed has something malicious in it or not. So really step 5 is, as I say, it's where the really clever stuff happens, but it's also the stuff that's more CPU intensive, can take a little bit longer, but it's very, very high detection rates and very few false negatives. And this sort of multi-tiered approach is something which I think is pretty unique to Fortinet and the Fortinet Security Fabric. And it's all about keeping performance figures high without compromising on security in any way. And you can see here in this slide that the security posture of some files can be worked out by the FortiMail or the FortiWeb. And in other cases, the files need to be submitted to Sandbox, sometimes to the pre-filtering stage, and other times to for full execution in a VM. There are lots of different ways to get Sandbox. It's available as a hardware appliance. There's 4 different hardware appliances available depending on your throughput requirements. We also have VM appliances, so you can host them in your own data center. The third option is software as a service, so as part of FortiCloud. If I have time later on, I'll show you FortiCloud and the sandboxing service, which you would get as part of the enterprise bundle or as a service add-on. And the last option then is a VM option, which is hosted in public cloud. So we have that supported currently in AWS, but I would imagine Azure will follow soon. And one of the key differentiators, I think, of the Fortisandbox is the range of input options available. As you can see in the screen there, FortiGate, FortiProxy, which is our new web filtering solution, separate to FortiGate, FortiMail, FortiWeb, which is our web application firewall, FortiADC, which is our application delivery controller or load balancer. All of these platforms can submit files to Fortisandbox for scanning. So they all operate within that Fortinet Security Fabric. And we don't have time to cover all of these today, but it's worth mentioning that the FortiWeb and FortiADC, they can be put in front of a web application that supports file upload, and they can act as an intermediary to screen files when a file is uploaded to an application, including sending that file to Sandbox for advanced threat detection. We can also integrate with third-party technology. So there's various different ways to do this with the Fortisandbox. The first option is file share scanning, and this is something which I think is a pretty cool feature, that basically any files that are put on an NFS or a CIFS share can be scanned by the Sandbox, and you can set that in newer versions of code as a lower priority task. So if the Sandbox is busy screening, email attachments or web browsing downloads, then you can have this as a function that happens when it's less busy. Another integration option is the API. So the Sandbox does come with an open API. If you have third-party products, software, maybe applications that need to integrate with Sandbox, that can be done through the API. We also have a network sniffer option, So you can monitor a port on your switch, plug that port into the Sandbox, and the Sandbox will sniff traffic and perform analysis of files that are seen on the wire. We also have Fabric partners. So these are third parties that have bought into the Fortinet Fabric concept, and we actually have a Fabric ready a partner program with lots of big names, including Carbon Black and Bit9 and also Symantec and Cisco and many others. And the last option then is the ICAP protocol. So you can submit files to the Sandbox from other third-party solutions over ICAP. So let's have a look at the Fortinet Security Fabric in action. And first of all, let's just see how some of the competitor solutions work in the most common threat vector, particularly for ransomware, is still email. And it's something that I believe is an Achilles heel for many of our competitors, is the fact that there can be a patient zero. So in the case that you have, say, a perimeter firewall detects an email coming inbound into the organization, the email, of course, gets forwarded into the mail relay, because the firewall is a low latency type appliance. It can't do store and forward of SMTP. And the file is sent to the Sandbox for further screening. And because it's zero-day threats that we're talking about here, both the Sandbox and indeed the mail relay, they might try and talk out to the cloud to see if it's a known threat. But if it's zero-day, then full VM extraction and emulation is required. And at that stage, of course, with other vendor solutions, typically your infected file has been forwarded onto your mail server. And of course, maybe signatures are sent to the firewall and subsequent incidences of the same file could be blocked, but at that stage it's too late. There's already a patient zero. So let's look at how that compares to the Fortinet Fabric approach. So with it, FortiMail, Sandbox, and FortiGate, if the email comes in, it doesn't need to be scanned by FortiGate if there's a FortiMail at play. The FortiMail can send that file to Sandbox. Obviously, the Sandbox may connect out to the Sandbox or FortiGuard cloud. But if we're talking about zero-day here, then full emulation is required. The big difference between this and the previous slide is that this time the FortiMail holds onto the email and waits for a result from Fortisandbox. And as you can see, the threat intelligence, once Sandbox has a result, is shared not just with the FortiMail, but also the FortiGate, FortiClient, FortiWeb, and indeed that threat intelligence gets fed back into the cloud. And of course, the email is dropped. Same thing can be done with FortiClient. Again, you can configure FortiClient to wait for a result from Fortisandbox before it allows the user access to the file. I just put in a screen grab of my FortiClient so you can see there, just under the IP address of the sandbox, there's an option to wait for the sandbox before it allows access. The other options further down, just out of interest, would be you can submit files that are executed from removable media and files that are executed from mapped network drives, obviously web downloads and email downloads. They're all supported with FortiClient. So that's all the slides I have. I'm just looking at the clock. We're not doing too badly for time, but I'll just give you a brief summary. Zero-day malware is easily produced these days. We saw that zero-day malware is common and very short-lived, and that traditional defenses can detect known good and known bad, but they struggle with those unknowns in the middle. And the sandboxing technology is really the only proven technology at the moment to detect unknown threats. And then the Fortisandbox has the most flexible input options of any vendor solution, and it will integrate with all of your existing Fortinet Security Fabric elements. I'm going to move on to FortiCloud Sandbox. So just to be clear, this is an optional service which can be purchased from FortiCloud, but it's essentially part of the enterprise bundle on the FortiGate. So as part of that, if I have a look at my home FortiGate here, you'll have this sandboxing tab, and obviously you need to configure an AV policy on your FortiGate. But when that's done, you can submit files up to Fortinet's cloud, the FortiCloud Sandbox, and you get a subset of the features that you would get with an on-premises appliance. You don't get the same level of diagnostics and sort of information about the file itself, but there's a pretty good, let me try and find something malicious. So if I go to last 30 days, no, there's nothing malicious, but you can see the files there. When they're clean, you get about this amount of information. When something malicious or suspicious is found, you get a whole lot more information. Something that is unique to Fortinet's cloud sandboxing is the ability to do on-demand. So this might be of interest if people were in a position to educate their staff that if they did find an email with a suspicious looking email or something with a link in it, they could train their staff to submit the URLs to the on-demand feature and check it out with sandboxing. So I think I might leave it at that, Chris. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to join the call. I hope you found it useful, and by all means, get in contact with the guys from Novosco if you would like further information on Fortisandbox or indeed any other Fortinet technology.